that smooth. Of course, there are some caveats here to this slowed down 120 FPS footage of Sekiro, as the game by default does not support above 60 FPS, nor does it by default support 21:9 monitors. But like any great PC experience where a version provided by the developer is not up to snuff, then the wonderful community comes in and tries to make it a bit better. That is where Sekiro is right now on PC. It feels so much better to play than the console versions, and it looks better too, but it is imperfect. That's really all needs to be said. But what is imperfect? Well, as I mentioned, the game is by default locked at 60 FPS. Intelligent modders have come in though and fixed that to a degree. Simply go to the PC Gaming Wiki and follow the instructions there on how to do it. I have played a little bit more than an hour of the game at an unlocked FPS target of 120 at 1440p and 1080p, and I found it extremely playable. It just looks gorgeous as the motion blur shutter speed scales properly with that frame rate, keeping everything looking ultra smooth. So there's an occasional hitch here or there on my Ryzen 1700X, and it really cannot propel each cutscene to 120 FPS for CPU reasons, but in gameplay it works marvelously, and it really sticks to that 120. The only bug I have noticed so far is occasionally how the character can walk slow for a bit after touching a wall, but it didn't happen other times, so I'm not sure what's happening there. So it's not native and not perfect yet, and I hope From Software implements an official high frame rate option in the future. Well, what else isn't perfect? The game's HDR does seem to work. Well, kind of. For me, it required alt-tabbing out and back into the game for the HDR toggle to stick, and so it didn't wash out the game colors. If you have an HDR display, alt-tab out and back in, and then toggle HDR to on. It has also been reported that some users are seeing the game being stuck to a limited gamma mode and washing out the colors. I don't think that's the case on my PC, but be mindful that that is a thing that has been reported. The last problem really is that the game does not natively support 21:9 resolutions, but once again, those wonderful modders have come in, and a quick stroll over to the PC Gaming Wiki will give you all the information you need to set that up. It's quite impressive what people can do without direct access to the game code, which makes me wonder why on earth are From Software not implementing these things themselves. It is 2019 and it would be way easier from their end. But those are the rough spots of the port as I see it. The rest is rather sublime. That taste of Nirvana was evident to me as I switched midway through playing on PC to check out that Xbox One X version, and boy, was that a rough transfer. Moving from a fluid 60 FPS, or Buddha forbid 120 FPS, to that rock solid 30 or 40 FPS? Well, maybe not that rock solid, was visually confusing and made gameplay way less consistent and honestly harder. Just trying to get footage for this video, I ended up dying to enemies and mini bosses so often, where on PC at a steady 60, I felt like I was the reason for the death. Not my inability to judge how far ahead of time I have to generously hold down the parry button, praying that it works, instead of lightly tapping it when it intuitively feels right. The game at a real fluid 60 feels almost completely different in controls and is much more enjoyable. It is not the only spot though where a well-equipped PC can power ahead. Looking at Xbox One X in comparison to PC settings, I was able to determine some of the key ones, but only some, as I will get to later in this video. Looking at shadows, they look to be around the high in terms of detail rendered. Ignore this shadow, by the way, that's just a fence post I did not knock down here on PC. But as you can see, on Xbox One X versus high on PC, it still looks a bit different. It looks smoother on PC. The max shadow setting looks even smoother and more detailed. The thing is, Xbox One X shadows don't seem to be filtered, or at least very poorly so, meaning their aliasing and edges show in the shadow maps much more. Just looking at this scene here, you can see how the shadows on Xbox One X are visibly aliasing rather often. Yet on high on PC, it's not as egregious. Max is even better. Moving over to SSAO, this is a tough one, so bear with me. The only real visible difference to tell max and high apart is the faint line outlining an object flush against another. Within the halo of screen space ambient occlusion, you can see a thin outline around an object, casting the shadow on high. On the max SSAO setting, this disappears. And guess what? That Xbox One X has that small outline in its SSAO. Therefore, I say it's closest to high. Reflections in the form of screen space reflections? Well, they look to be high on Xbox One X. On max, arbitrary materials in the game that are smooth enough will have reflections. On high, yeah, they do too, but only at grazing angles and more towards the center of the screen. Xbox One X has these more limited reflections in this puddle here, just like high. Then we have the lighting quality setting, which can be discerned by the distance it takes for a light to render. Here in this scene, I can actually see that distance by which that light renders by its effect of clipping through the geometry, and since it's unshadowed, it also affects volumetric fog, clipping through the geometry. So the further away that light pops in, the higher the setting. Looking through the settings, I can say the distance it pops in on Xbox One X is closest to the high setting, with max being much further out, and medium just being a tiny bit closer. The last real easily comparable setting is in motion blur. On PC, this controls actually two things, since they are linked: the amount of samples or slices comprising that motion blur, and the amount it applies in actual intensity. The intensity can be higher, and the tail of the motion blur can be longer at higher settings, since it is made up of more slices. Pretty funny how that works. Either way, looking at the effect on Xbox One X versus PC, we can see that the console is using the high setting when you count those samples and look at how intense it is. That's it, really. All the other settings on PC pose a great challenge in comparison, or they're so similar and inconsequentially small. So tweaking on PC means knowing which settings to go for and which ones actually seem to work. In terms of ones that don't really work, the automatic adjustment of settings setting. For all my frame rate tests, I ended up heavily downclocking the RTX 2080 Ti to show frame rate metrics below 60 FPS at 4K, as otherwise, I would honestly always be above 60 FPS. But even then, here, this automatic adjustment of settings option does nothing. Even at 30 FPS, it does not uplift the frame rate when greatly below 60 FPS, nor does it affect the image quality when greatly below 60 FPS. I thought I was maybe breaking the setting with such console-like performance, so I upclocked the GPU to the exact point where it would be directly at 60 but a bit under. Still, even then, the setting did nothing, so leave this off at the moment. I can't get it to work. Tell me if you could in the comments. Then you have the shading quality option, which in a variety of different views and looking at different effects and materials did absolutely nothing. So just as a precaution, leave this one to a high at the moment and maybe tell me if you could find a difference. The texture quality option, yeah, that just affects the level of anisotropic filtering as you can see on the ground here, not the actual resolution of the textures themselves loading into VRAM. Yep, look at the main character here. There's no difference in texture resolution between the settings, not even on the environment as well as I could find. As I see it, the game uses between 6 and 7 gigabytes at max settings at 4K on this RTX 2080 Ti, so I do not think many will be VRAM limited even on mid-range GPUs. But even then, 4K will be out of reach for those GPUs at 60 FPS anyway. 1080p and 1440p have much more reasonable VRAM usage that stays within modest 6 to 8 gigabyte budgets. But then there are the options which actually affect performance and visuals, and this is where there's some nice tweaking to be had. The first area is shadows. Going from max to high is a modest 4% increase, max to medium 9% increase, and max to low a 15% performance increase. Unlike Xbox One X, which has rather unfiltered looking shadows, I think high here on PC is rather good looking and a good compromise for a tiny uptick in performance. So use high for optimized settings. How about SSAO? Well, max to high sees at best a 1% performance increase. But the visual difference is also extremely small, as I mentioned. Max to medium is around 3% performance increase, with SSAO starting to look a bit last gen and not too awesome. Max to off is around a 6% performance increase on average. While I do want to say go to max here, Xbox One X has non-arbitrarily set this to high, so let's be cautious for now and use high for more optimized settings. Volumetrics is an interesting one. Between max and low, there are measurable visual and performance differences. Kind of. Between max and medium, we see extremely similar visual results, as you can see here in the side-by-side when sitting still. As of making this video, I think the game uses that frustum-aligned volumetric fog that we've seen in tons of games this generation. And the thing that gives it away to me is how volumetric point lights tend to clip through geometry until you get closer, and how it kind of vibrates and cascades. I cannot see a difference between medium and max though for the most part. Even when walking forward here, between max and medium volumetrics both have that same aliasing pattern and frequency of aliasing where it looks like a CRT refresh rate occurring in the volumetrics itself. The greatest change is when you set volumetrics to low, which seemingly turns off the ability for lights to affect this fog volume, which you can see here. In this scene at best, maybe going from max to medium sees the volumetric fog looking a little bit less dense. Maybe. Maybe my eyes are also tricking me, but the performance speaks where visuals cannot. Going from max to high sees a 7% performance increase. Max to medium is a 10% performance increase, and max to low, which turns it off, a 13% performance increase. Since the visuals are so similar, I actually recommend medium here for optimized settings, but if you can find a difference, and I would like to know, so write a comment below if you can. Reflections show that same difference I mentioned earlier. Going from max to high is around a 5% or maybe 7% performance increase, with reflections disappearing more readily along their height. And going from max to low sees screen space reflections disappearing entirely, but also a healthy 11% performance increase or so. Here I recommend the high setting just like Xbox One X. That lighting quality setting which controls the distance at which point lights render, I had really hard time finding any performance difference. In fact, that average distance on low is enough to keep most lights on in most scenes in comparison to max even, so there's really no performance difference here that I could find. Still, From Software did leave the setting on high on Xbox One X for performance reasons, so I recommend high here as well, which will keep the lights on in most views this game will ever throw at you. Motion blur, well, this is a preference as always. Higher settings means better quality and an increase in the intensity of the effect. There is a difference in performance that is measurable though. Going from high to medium shows a negligible difference in performance. Going from high to low, which has very few samples and a very low intensity, saw a 6% performance increase. High to off is around 10% better for performance or so. This is user preference, but I prefer high for optimized settings in this game. Then you have the water quality setting, and this one is really simple. The water surface between the two settings of high and low are in fact identical when put side to side. The difference occurs actually in interaction. When putting the setting to low, this turns off the dynamic geometry deformation that occurs when objects move in the water, which is really rather neat looking. I basically saw no performance difference here, and I imagine this is just a curio. Unless you have a terrible GPU and terrible CPU, leave this one to high. In a From Software first, we actually see a rather competent anti-aliasing in the game engine now, in a form of temporal supersampling anti-aliasing. I actually like how it looks here and the way it smooths the image and kills jaggies. Turning it to off will yield a 4 to 5% performance increase. I recommend leaving it on, but if you don't like it, turn it off and inject your own AA with reshade or your graphics control panel, as this game is a DX11 one. So in the end, my recommended settings look like this, and the Xbox One X settings look like this. Not too terribly different, eh? Well, it looks graphically fine on Xbox One X as I see it. It just performs rather terribly. But that is what we're trying to do here. We're trying to avoid bad performance. So how do these settings fare? Well, on the mid-range, the AMD RX 580 and NVIDIA GTX 1060 coupled with a Intel Core i5 8400 and 16 gigabytes of 2667 MHz DDR4, we see some generally excellent results at 1080p. Both GPUs manage a very respectable 60 FPS with headroom to spare to turn up other settings such as shadow quality, which has a nice visual result on max. The one thing I noticed though is that the RX 580 in this PC had more visible, very short burst frame rate drops or stutters on traversal and on rapid camera turns. At 1080p though, both GPUs managed to do well in a scenario that is one of the most GPU intensive areas I have seen so far in the game due to the amount of alpha effects and particles it uses. That surprised me greatly actually with the GTX 1060. At 1440p, things change up though in a way that I'm not used to seeing here with these GPUs. In the first stage of testing, the GTX 1060 and RX 580 do a pretty good job at 1440p and maintaining that 60 FPS. With some odd stutters here though still on that RX 580. Even then it was visible on this stage that alpha effects at this resolution could be too much for both GPUs to bear and maintain 60 FPS. What surprises me though is how the RX 580 seems to be faring worse when arterial viscera jets out of NPCs' necks. When we go over to the more GPU intensive stage, then it really heats up. Here the RX 580 is spending quite a lot of time below 60 FPS and hits the upper 40s here and there when it is combined with that kill spray of particles. On the other hand, the GTX 1060 does pretty darn well. Sure, it has some drops, but I honestly believe that with a GPU overclock, it could be a pretty great 1440p experience in this game. Usually it's the other way around, with the RX 580 winning at this resolution especially. So as I see it, either From Software has to work on their AMD optimization, AMD has to work on optimization for this game, or something this game especially does with its alpha effects and streaming does not like the AMD driver. Going to the ultra high end is quite the revelation. The RTX 2080 Ti is capable of playing the game at the highest settings possible, at 4K at 60 FPS, and I've never seen the game drop a frame below 60 FPS on the GPU side of things, where I imagine Dark Souls games in the past might have struggled, especially in some areas with lots of alpha effects. I really think that they worked on their art workflow here and managed how they used alpha effects differently. Blood sprays and flames do not kill the GPU so much as they used to in older versions of this engine. It should be noted that there is an occasional tiny hiccup in frame rate on PC, and I think that comes from their streaming system. The RTX 2080 Ti can also play the game at max settings at 120 FPS, at 1440p or 1080p, with once again the caveat that there's those tiny little hiccups here and there from what I can assume is only streaming. So in the end, I think the game on PC is technically competent. From Software have really upped the visual game in their engine with modern features. Remember when Dark Souls 2 cut out real-time shadow maps in development and looked really generationally different in the end? Well, here they are finally there in Sekiro. Finally. Also now there's competent SSAO, competent temporal anti-aliasing, and an actual volumetric effects and lighting. That's awesome. It also can be 60 FPS on PC, which this game very much so needs. Not only have From Software looked into cinematic displays and high frame rate, so the community does not have to do their job for them. Until they do that, I hope you enjoyed this video on Sekiro's PC version, which I'm pretty sure is actually the lead version of the game that they developed for. If you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to talk to me about your experience with this game on PC, well, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen!